Change happens slowly. Then all of a sudden, at least that's often how we experience change, especially things like climate change. At some point, these slow-moving changes jump from abstract to very real. When did climate change become real for you? For me, sure, I found Al Gore and his charts and graphs compelling. That information was scary, but it was still abstract. It wasn't until the fall of 2012 that I actually felt climate change as something real. I just moved to Montana and started my job as a professor. A wildfire broke out close to town. Colleagues were evacuated, and the smoke was suffocating. I'd never dealt with wildfire smoke before. It felt unfamiliar and apocalyptic. And I had a lot of doubt. What should I do with my small children? Was it okay to exercise? Could I go outside? Could my house actually burn down? I felt scared. I knew that wildfires were nothing new, but now I lived in a place where things regularly burned. And those burns were getting more frequent, more powerful, and more destructive. Climate change became real to me that fall, and I wanted to learn more about it and use whatever skills I have to be a part of solutions. Our current moment in wildfire is attributable to three forces: climate change, how and where we build our homes, and our 100-year commitment to wildfire suppression. These forces create the devastating megafires, the subject of some really good TED Talks, that now seem normal. And as we've seen in Lahaina and Paradise, wildfires are now leveling entire towns in a matter of minutes and hours. Wildfires certainly here. Climate change is certainly real here in Montana. Just ask the wildland firefighters whose fire seasons have become fire years. I fear it will become really real when one of our communities burns to the ground. It could be Billings, or pretty much anywhere in Montana. And if we keep doing what we're doing, it's not a matter of if, but when. But it doesn't have to go that way. Climate change is so often portrayed as something happening to us that we as individuals have little to no control over. But wildfire is one area within climate where we can actually make a difference. The problem is solvable, and each of us has a role to play. So how do we solve it? Well, sometimes properly defining the problem is the hardest step. What actually is the problem? It is not wildfire. Wildfires are neither good nor bad, they just are. They've been around longer than we have and will persist long after we're gone. The problem is people, us. So how do we get here? Well, some scholars contend that our connection with fire is what makes us human. Richard Wrangham is an emeritus professor at Harvard. He's an evolutionary anthropologist, and through a series of clever experiments with mice, he demonstrated that eating cooked food versus raw food produces bigger brains. Cooked food takes less energy to digest, and big brains take more energy to power. Figuring out how to cook our food freed up the energy required to power big brains. And based on this connection, Wrangham proposed that the moment we learned how to cook our food was the moment we became human. That moment came about 2 million years ago, and it set in motion an evolutionary process that ultimately led to the big brain beings we are today. In other words, fire and our ability to control it is what makes us human. And as it turns out, we really like to burn stuff. Not only does it cook our food, it does all sorts of work that make our lives much easier. We burn stuff to heat our houses, drive our cars, power our computers. Essentially, the entirety of our modern economy relies on burning stuff. And the more stuff we burn, especially fossil fuels, the more carbon we dump into the atmosphere, making our temperatures warmer and warmer. So here's a dark irony. Fire might have made us human, but our addiction to it is now threatening our species' ability to survive. Climate change brings with it all kinds of problems, but one big one is that warmer temperatures mean more fire. The temperatures on Earth right now are associated with more fire than we're currently experiencing. We are in a fire deficit and should expect more fire. The second factor is the legacy of wildfire suppression. Over 2 days in August 1910, over 3 million acres of forest burned across eastern Washington, the Idaho Panhandle, and western Montana. This great burn led the fledgling United States Forest Service to develop a vast wildland firefighting apparatus fashioned after the military. It's important to note that the Forest Service was and is part of the Department of Agriculture. This conception views trees as a crop, a natural resource to be managed. So it makes sense that the Forest Service would dedicate itself to putting out any and all fire. And putting out all wildfires might seem like a good idea, and in many cases it is, but it has two big unintended consequences. The first is that most of our forests have adapted to regular wildfire. Low to medium intensity fires would burn on 10 to 20 year intervals. Many species rely on this sort of fire to reproduce. There's some types of pine cones that only open when exposed to wildfire. And the second piece is the accumulation of fuel. Without periodic wildfire to thin out our forests, they became clogged with all sorts of flammable material and downfall. So here's another dark irony. We became so good at putting out fires that our forests became choked with fuel for future fires. Finally, we need to talk about the WUI, the wildland-urban interface. Even if you don't know what that is, chances are high you probably live in it. It's the area where our built environment intermingles with the forest. Most of us here in Montana love this zone. It might even be why you live here. Right now, 1 out of every 3 homes in the United States sits in the WUI. But building our houses deeper and deeper into the forest is a dangerous proposition. When those fires burn, so do the houses. So we've warmed our climate, and we've loaded a bunch more fuel on the landscape. Again, that's a dangerous proposition. But we got ourselves into this mess, we can get ourselves out. And some progress is happening, but it's slow, and we're a bit stuck. Why are we stuck? Well, the more you look, the more reasons you'll find, but they roll up into 3 main categories. The first, changing culture is hard. We've built a culture of suppressing wildfire, and that culture is deeply entrenched in our institutions and public expectation. We expect wildfires to be put out. The second is a concept from law and economics called moral hazard. This occurs when the party that makes a decision doesn't bear the full cost of that decision. Municipalities rely on property taxes to fund their operations. And when they approve new construction in the WUI, they often don't consider the full cost of protecting that new construction from fire, because those costs are largely borne by the federal and state governments. It's the feds and the states that do most of the wildfire fighting. This disconnect creates a moral hazard that perpetuates building deeper and deeper into the forests. And finally, in case you hadn't noticed, it's an election year. There's little folks agree on when it comes to politics, but one thing I think we can all agree on is that it's difficult to get things done. Our political gridlock stymies changing our wildfire ways. So how do we move forward? Well, perhaps slowly, and then all of a sudden. It's going to be slow at first because each of us needs to take action and inspire others in our institutions to get on board. So first, change your home. A little over 20 years ago, Forest Service scientist Jack Cohen arrived at remarkably a simple insight with profound implications. He noticed that homes weren't catching fire from flames, but rather from floating embers, often from a fire miles away, that would find a weakness in the structure, a clogged gutter, debris in an eave, an unscreened vent. This led Dr. Cohen to conceive of the home ignition zone. It's the area surrounding your home with all the vulnerabilities to wildfire. The critical insight for you and me is that we must begin to view our homes as fuel. All the fire sees is fuel. And armed with this perspective, there are so many things we can do to make our homes more resistant to wildfire. We can clean our gutters. We can remove flammable debris from underneath our decks. We can landscape with gravel. Beyond that, there are all kinds of innovative materials and design we can embrace. Getting rid of wooden roofs is a big one. Some of the stuff is easy and cheap, and others more difficult and expensive. The good news is there are programs to help, and funding is available. Firewise.org is a great resource to help you get started. The next level involves changing your community. You can protect your own home from wildfire, but it doesn't do you much good if your neighbor's house goes up in flames. Wildfire safety is a collective action problem, meaning it takes effort from all of us to ensure the group's safety. So, talk to your neighbors. Teach them about the home ignition zone, and maybe even help them get started. Wildfire safety is a great, nonpartisan issue around which we can rebuild community spirit. The next level involves what have become four-letter words here in Montana: zoning and code. We need to embrace the reality that there are some places where we just shouldn't be building. They are too prone to wildfire. And any new construction in the WUI needs to prioritize wildfire safety in the permitting process. This is difficult, but it's not impossible. And there are some good examples we can learn from. Boulder County, Colorado, South Lake Tahoe, Lakeside, Arizona. And if we can't summon the political will to get this done, market mechanisms like mortgage lending and insurance are surely to step in. We're seeing that in parts of Montana already. Finally, we need to embrace the inconvenient and perhaps counterintuitive truth that more fire, not less, is our way forward. As I mentioned before, climate change and fire suppression have put us in a fire deficit. And the only way through it is embracing more fire. To get our systems back in balance, we need to let some wildfires burn when conditions are right, and even set fire intentionally to the land when we can do so safely. This is really difficult to do, but it is possible. The Forest Service says it wants to increase burning and even acknowledges that some wildfires should be let burn for resource benefit. But progress is slow. Indigenous tribes have a rich tradition of cultural burning, not only for ceremony, but also for land management. And lands under the management of the Bureau of Indian Affairs are some of the only places we're seeing an increase in prescribed burning right now. Their progress can be a guiding light. This focus on wildfire is not the turn one might expect from a business school professor. I certainly didn't see it coming. But the more I learned about it, the more convinced I became that this is a problem we can actually solve. We have the tools and the knowledge. We just need to execute. Wildfires will burn and sometimes rage on this planet long after humans are gone. So it's not a question of if we can control fire. It's a question of if we can learn to live with it. Or perhaps more accurately, it's a question of if we can learn to live with it together.